about that right now. And now I'll introduce our speaker. So Dr. Johanna Bernier is a professor at the University of Maryland's Department of Government and Politics and is the director of GVPT Global Learning. Dr. Bernier studies the effect of identity on contentious political outcomes and has done extensive fieldwork in the Andes, Southeast Europe, and Indonesia. Johanna, you can take it away.
Thank you, Erin. Let me just share my screen here. So thank you for the introduction, and thank you to START for hosting this webinar. As Erin said, I'm Johanna Bernier, and I'm going to be talking today about my recent book with Neil Shatana, my fabulous co-author. And this book just came out in May of 22. So it's very recent, and it's particularly fun for me to return to START to talk about this book because this project builds to a great extent on work that I did with some START folks, and the data collection specifically for this project was funded by DHS through START. So the book is Alternatives in Mobilization. Let me make sure that I can control the slides here. Erin has told me that I have about 45 minutes to tell you about the book. I'll try my best to keep within that time frame, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So the outline of what I will be telling you today is, first of all, I want to sort of tell you what the general question is that we look at in the book, and in particular, what the puzzle is that motivated our inquiry. Then I'll sketch the theory and the testable implications of the theory. I'll tell you about the cross-national data collection that we conducted for the project and the tests that we did to assess the accuracy of our implications. And then I'll talk briefly about the case studies that we conducted to sort of probe the internal validity of the theory. I'll conclude and talk a little bit about future directions, and then we'll move on to the Q&A. So the observation that really sort of motivates our inquiry is the fact that we do observe in politics, both peaceful and contentious politics, that identity is mobilized across political settings, and we want to know more about what determines which identity is mobilized in any given political setting. And we know a lot about this topic already from the literature. In particular, there are two large literatures, the literature on cross-cutting and segmented cleavages and the minimum winning coalition, that tell us, that sort of inform us about when and how we should expect identity mobilization in politics to occur. The cross-cutting literature, and let me just define my terms a little bit in case someone isn't familiar with this particular terminology. When we're talking about cross-cutting identities, we're talking about identities that are shared between two individuals. And when we talk about segmented identities, we're talking about identities that are not shared. So think about, for example, Sinhalese Buddhists in Sri Lanka versus the Tamil Hindus. Those are two groups that are segmented on both ethnicity and religion, versus the French and the Italians in Switzerland, who are segmented on one identity, but share a second identity that is religion, as both are predominantly Roman Catholic. So this literature tells us, the literature on cross-cutting and segmented cleavages tells us that when identities are segmented, politics tends to be more zero-sum. What your group gets, mine doesn't. And as a consequence, tends to be more contentious. It's easier to mobilize in politics against an opponent that doesn't share any of your culture. Whereas when groups share some identity, politics tends not to be zero-sum to the same extent, because groups often share spoils of of government based on their identity. And as a consequence, politics tends to be more moderated and less likely to be as contentious and even violent. And these are observations that have been shown across multiple case studies, and these have been tested in a number of studies, cross-national studies. So this is a very well-established, empirically tested theory. And then there's the minimum winning coalition theory, which tells us more about, in a given political situation, what is the particular identity that we should expect to see mobilized. And briefly, what the minimum winning coalition tells us is that the identity we should expect to see is the smallest of the identity coalition that is large enough to beat out any other identity coalition. And the minimum winning coalition also tells us that as long as this large coalition distributes spoils among its members, it's going to be stable. Therefore, given what we know from these literatures, it is curious to us that violent conflict in civil war mostly occurs between groups that share at least one identity, not groups that are fully segmented by identities. And it has recently been shown that ethnic minimum winning coalitions are neither common nor particularly stable. So the theory that we propose in this book is that both the cross-cutting literature and the minimum winning coalition theory are correct. We're not disputing the accuracy of either one, but we add that these are starting propositions only. And so we think there's a great deal of unexplained variance in identity configurations that influence participants' incentives for mobilization. And it's this variance in identity configurations that we are especially interested in. So we make the argument that demographics, in particular groups' relative size compared to each other and their intersection of identities, is going to influence identity mobilization in politics in ways that we don't fully understand yet. In the book, we spend a great deal of time convincing the reader that there is this variance across time and space. So here you see some different continents where we have colored identity groups, geolocated and colored locations of identity groups, and the height indicates their varying size, right? So across space, certainly there is a great deal of variance. And we, in our chapter where we're examining demographics, and we're sort of convincing the reader that this is a worthwhile thing to study, we highlight a number of demographic changes that we think tell us something interesting about politics. Just to give you one example, we point out that if you look at a proportional size of religious adherence in countries in Africa over time, we see this very interesting story of how Christianity, and those are the yellow circles, has sort of over time moved across the southern part of the African continent, whereas Islam, and these are the red circles, predominates historically and currently in the north. And then we further point out that if you then look at absolute size of Islamic and Christian groups over time, you see that the explosive growth in populations of both types of groups has occurred most notably across sort of the conflict belt of the African continent. And we think that this may, or we suggest in the book, that this may this illustrates an important insight with respect to resource scarcity and population growth, that it's not just that these two religions over time have come in closer contact, but precisely where they've come in closer contact, you have had an explosive population growth in the context of resource scarcity. And this may help us understand why we are seeing greater levels of conflict in precisely this region. So in the book, we then go on to build a theory of identity mobilization as a function of how groups are demographically balanced. And by groups, I'm referring to political majority groups and political minority groups, and how identities are segmented or shared across these groups. And this theory generates multiple testable implications depending on the demographic balance and the sharing of the identities, one of which we then focus on testing in the remainder of the book. And this implication of our theory that we focus on testing is the minority challenger winning coalition. So what I want to do next is I want to sort of give you the intuition for what we're trying to argue with the minority challenger winning coalition before I show you some results. So what we see here is a classic outbidding story. This is very well documented in the literature. This is Horowitz, who is best known for articulating this story, or this type of a story, where you see a case where you have ethnic groups that are segmented. They belong to different ethnicities, and they're also segmented on religion. According to Horowitz, this is a very explosive demographic scenario. And his best known example is Sri Lanka, where the large Sinhalese Buddhist majority outbid against each other. Political parties within the Sinhalese majority outbid against each other, targeting the Tamil Hindu minority. Now, the Tamil Hindu minority responded in kind, and what ensued was a decades-long and bloody civil war. Toft has told us a similar story about Sudan, where Northern Arab Muslim majority factions outbid against each other, targeting the Southern Christian minority, arguably leading to the Sudanese civil war and secession of South Sudan. So this is a very well-known classic story of segmentation and how segmented identity can lead to violent identity conflict. In contrast, we also know well Leiphardt's story, where groups that may be segmented on one identity share another identity. And this tends to moderate politics. And this is the story that Leiphardt tells about a lot of European countries, including Switzerland, where, for example, the French and the Italians are both Roman Catholic, and so they're unlikely to mobilize against each other or against the majority. In this kind of a scenario, an ethnic majority has less of an incentive to target a minority for a variety of reasons. It's more difficult to target someone and mobilize against someone who shares some of your identity. And the minority group has very little incentive to engage the majority in conflict because of size differences and resource and concomitant resource differences, and is more likely to sort of seek shelter with the majority on the basis of this shared identity. And this is, as I said, has been tested cross-nationally. We think this is a very helpful illustration of a number of cases. However, what we ask is, what happens when you change the underlying demographics? So think about a case like this, where instead of being very small, the ethnic group, the ethnic minority group, is increasingly similar in size to the ethnic majority group. And then think if, what if these two groups are engaged in a political contestation? When you have this type of a demographic, when you change to this type of a demographic, then all of a sudden it's possible that leaders of the smaller ethnic group, of the ethnic minority group, start seeing the shared identity as an opportunity. Because if they are able to lead a mobilization of the shared identity and shift the political mobilization from one of ethnicity to one of, in this case, religion, all they need to do is poach a few members of the majority, and they potentially can build a coalition that's large enough to unseat the status quo majority. Now, what about the minimum winning coalition, you ask? Doesn't the minimum winning coalition tell us that members of the majority are never going to defect? And so this effort by the minority leaders to try to recruit from the majority are going to be in vain? Well, the assumptions of the minimum winning coalition are that majorities have access to the spoils of the state, as a function of being in charge. And they distribute those spoils equitably among members of their coalition. Members of the coalition know that they are members of the winning coalition, and they don't much care about the content of the identity that is being mobilized. And we agree, as long as these assumptions hold, it's unlikely that minority leaders can poach anybody from the minimum winning ruling coalition, and that coalition is likely to be quite stable. However, recent literature has also told us that oftentimes, especially in developing countries, clientelistic spoils, or the spoils that the winning coalition has access to, are often quite meager. And more importantly, there's great variance in how benefits are distributed within the winning coalition. So it's very possible that you belong to, even if you are in the winning coalition, you may belong to a faction that doesn't get much of the spoils, doesn't have access to much of the spoils. Furthermore, in situations with low information, you may not know what coalition is the winning coalition and whether you belong to the winning coalition. And arguably, as information is deteriorating in contexts such as civil war, this becomes more of a problem. And then finally, we have learned that a lot of people actually care quite a bit about which cleavage or which identity is being mobilized. So some people may belong to a majority winning coalition, but if they prefer a religious coalition rule the state, they may indeed defect based on the content of the mobilization that's being offered. So the argument that we are making in the book then is that members of large minority groups that are left out of or underrepresented through identity-based minimum winning coalition will seek access by redefining the axis of identity competition to mobilize a potentially oversized challenger winnings coalition of an alternate identity that is shared with the majority. Now, what you will notice here is that we're not talking about ethnicity and religion. We're just talking about identity. And the theory as we develop it does not pertain specifically to ethnicity or religion. We think that this sort of generically describes identity mobilization. However, to test this theory, we have to test implications that pertain specifically to given political contexts. And so one of the contexts that we focus on is ethnic civil war. And so in that case, the testable implication for ethnic civil war is that leaders representing ethnic minorities that share religion with majorities are increasingly likely to mobilize the religious identity as the demographic balance of the groups becomes more even. So how do we test this? Well, the dependent variable that we use is based on the Uppsala conflict data coding of civil war, where there are 25 battle deaths or more in a year. And the dependent variable that we use is Svensson and Nielsen's coding of that data for religious incompatibility. So Svensson and Nielsen took all of the UCDP organizational data and coded rhetoric of organizational leaders for religious incompatibility to find out whether leaders at some point of organizations were claiming religious incompatibility. We then took that data and coded the organizational information at the group level, because that's where we think that this opportunity structure argument that we're making is taking place. So each ethnic group then in a given year is coded as either claiming religious incompatibility with the state or not. We then merged this with all of the regular controls, national cross-cutting, which is the sharing and segmentation of identities at the national level, regime type, GDP, separatism, time, and I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A if somebody is interested. Our independent variables are of two kinds then. The first is the ethnic group sample frame, where we get our demographic information from. And this is work that dates back to 2015 and 2018 and was done in collaboration with people that are at START, in particular, Jonathan Wilkenfeld and Amy Pate. And in this work, we outlined a sample frame of about 1,200 ethnic majorities and minorities that are not politically defined. And so this sample frame can then be used to test political, not just trajectories, but correlates of activity that various ethnic groups undertake, including mobilization. The book then builds on this sample frame by coding all groups in the sample frame for religion, both family and sect, and whether in a given country any majority and minority share or are segmented by religion. And this is work that was funded by DHS, Science and Technology Directorate, through START. We found a lot of interesting things in the data. We saw that Christianity predominates among ethnic groups, followed by Islam and animism. And a number of groups practice some sort of a syncretic religion. We also found a number of interesting things when we looked at overlap and segmentation. In particular, I want to draw your attention to the fact that Christian groups, majorities and minorities, are much more likely to be found in countries where they share religion, or they're much more likely to share religion than they are to be segmented by religion. This is less true for Muslim groups, meaning there are also a lot of them that share religion, minorities and majorities, ethnic groups, but there are significantly higher number than for Christian groups that are segmented by religion, meaning there are a lot of Muslim minorities that live in countries where the majority is of a different religion. And the same is true for animist groups. And we thought this was very interesting. It's sort of basic knowledge that we didn't necessarily know about sharing and segmentation of identities. Our independent variables then are coded as first a demographic variable that accounts for each ethnic minority group proportional size relative to the ethnic majority size in that country. So at 0, the groups are at parity. An increasingly small number indicates that the minority is very small, and an increasingly large number indicates or closer to 0, and above 0 it indicates that the minority is demographically very large. And we do have some political minorities that are demographically larger than the political majorities, though this is not common. We then code all groups for religion, both family and for Christian and Muslim groups, sect. We then also account for whether each minority shares a religion with the majority in that country or is segmented from it on religion. And then for our testing, we interact the demographic variable with the variable accounting for sharing of religion, because we expect there to be a slope change if a group shares religion with if a minority group shares religion with the majority. So just to remind you what the testable implication is that we are examining. We expect that leaders representing ethnic minorities that share religion with majorities are increasingly likely to mobilize religious identity as the demographic balance of the groups becomes more even. And we test this on a subsample of the AMAR sample frame, which is all ethnic groups in civil war as defined by the UCDP data. Before I show you the regression results, I just want to show you the demographic t-tests that are sort of support the intuition here. Here we have split ethnic groups in civil war up by whether they share religion or do not share religion. These are minority groups, either share religion or do not share religion with the majority groups. And you see that if they share a religion, they are significantly closer in size to the majority than groups that do not share religion with majorities. And if we're only looking at groups that claim religious incompatibility, that difference is even more stark. So closer to size means that the minority is closer to 0 when compared to the majority group. So at 0, the groups are at parity. And the same is true if we look at groups that share religion and claim religious incompatibility. With respect to the majority groups, they are closer in size. They tend to be larger than all other groups that either do not share religion and or do not claim religious incompatibility. So these are our regression results. I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. The first is that when we're not accounting for our interaction, shared family and population balance, we support the literature that states that on average, looking across countries, when you have a greater level of shared identity than religious incompatibility or conflict claims are lower. However, when we account for group size, and especially for groups that share a religious family, we have a sign change. Now, these sorts of interactions with multiple constituent terms, especially in logit regressions, are difficult to interpret. And so we have here the margins plot, the marginal effects plot. And what this margins plot illustrates is that if you look at the x-axis, that accounts for this majority-minority population balance. As I said, at 0, majorities and minorities are at parity. And this the y-axis accounts for the likelihood that minorities are going to claim religious incompatibility in civil war. The dotted line shows you this probability for groups that share religion, minorities that share religion with their majorities, and the solid line shows you this probability for groups that are segmented on religion with their majorities, with their ethnic majorities. And the graph illustrates that as minority groups are increasingly close in size, as minority ethnic groups are increasingly close in size with the political majorities in their country, when they share religion, they are increasingly likely to claim, minorities are increasingly likely to claim religious incompatibility in ethnic civil war. And the reverse is true for minorities that are segmented on religion from the political majorities in their country. We, of course, were concerned about a number of things in our statistical test, one being outliers, another one being the absolute size of the group, because you know, that it does happen that political minorities are larger demographically than their majorities, but we think we're less interested in this part of the picture because we think that there are different incentives possibly at play. So we wanted to make sure that we were accurately testing on the sample of groups that fit the conditions that we are laying out in our theory. And of course, we were interested in outliers. And basically, I'm just zooming in on the bottom part of the regression here. And the first thing that you see is that we have a good reason to be concerned about outliers. Outliers are very influential. There are very different political dynamics taking place in various countries. But even when accounting for outliers, our main effect does not go away. And the same is true for when we exclude all countries that have political minorities that are demographic majorities. Our finding still holds. We were also interested in probing the alternative hypothesis that really what we're seeing here is just sectarian war, that the groups that we code as sharing a family of religion are really separated by sect, and therefore they are, they are mobilizing against each other. We know this from various cases in the world. Protestants and Catholics battle each other, as do Sunni and Shia. So we coded a variable accounting for sharing of sect, and we ran the same analysis. And the idea here is that if what we were picking up, it was just a sectarian effect, then our main effect would go away when we account for sharing of sect. And so just to sort of, focus in on the bottom part of the graph, we find that even when we account for sharing of sect and not just of family, our main effect still holds. Groups that share sect with minority groups that share sect with their majorities, with their political majorities, as the groups become increasingly similar in size, the minority leaders are more likely to claim religious incompatibility for mobilization. Now that we have looked at the external validity of our implication of our theory, we also wanted to make sure that our ideas and our theory had internal validity, that it made sense, that the story we were telling actually described accurately the conflict dynamics on the ground. And it was very important to us that this not be understood to be an account of doctrine, because as I told you earlier, first of all, the theory itself is agnostic as to the identity type. So it could be various, the basic identity could be religion, the segmenting identity could be religion, and we could be talking about mobilization of ethnicity, and there could also be other identity types at play. So we're definitely not talking about only ethnicity and religion, and within mobilization of religion, we're not talking about doctrine. So we should see, our expectation is that we should see support for this theory across religions. So we went back to the data, and we created a list of all minority groups that claim religious incompatibility in ethnic civil war. And then we randomly picked a group from the set of groups that were Christian groups, and we randomly picked a group from Muslim groups. And then Nepal self-selected because there was only one Hindu case. And what we found was that our story, we think, is very well supported in the case of Pakistan. The Pashtuns, well, to back up a little, Pakistan, scholars largely agree that Pakistan was established as a secular Muslim nation. And early on, after the founding of Pakistan, the primary conflict, identity conflict that the country witnessed was a secessionist conflict. And that included Pashtuns and others that had mobilized on ethnic identity for a separate state, or for separate states. And then over time, as the government sort of opened up to religion, opened up for the mobilization of religion, ethnic groups, we started to see this type of rhetoric among ethnic groups. And the Pashtuns in particular mobilized against the Punjabis and just the state in general in an attempt to unite various different ethnic groups in a religious mobilization, in a challenge to the state. And Pakistan is a particularly interesting case because we see other ethnic groups that in many ways, like the Balochs, are very comparable to the Pashtuns. They also engaged in a lengthy secessionist conflict against the state. They also have territories that border Afghanistan. They are also living in areas that are economically underdeveloped, but never led a alternative mobilization of religion. And we argue that in part that can be attributed to the fact that the Balochs are significantly smaller when compared to the political majority than are the Pashtuns. Uganda, similarly, in Uganda, we found evidence of the challenger winning coalition in Alice Lackawanna's mobilization, early mobilization, where she where she, as a member of the Akoli, worked to unite various ethnic groups in a challenge to the state. Uganda taught us a number of interesting things. We saw, for example, the importance of the underlying ethnic fragmentation of the country, which seemed to affect where the leaders of the mobilization are drawing their additional support from. So when a country is very fragmented, like Uganda, leaders may choose not to appeal to members of the majority group, but may be able to appeal to a sufficient number of other excluded ethnic groups to build a coalition that is a viable challenger to the state. We then, the Ugandan history then continues, and I don't think that you can make the case that the LRA was a challenger winning coalition. That was something entirely different in terms of mobilization, relying on abductions and such. But we do think that the early mobilization in Uganda shows evidence or supports the story that we're telling about the challenger winning coalition. And then we looked at Nepal, and Nepal was very interesting also because it very neatly fits or very neatly supports our story, except for the fact that we had assumed when we went into testing that mobilization about religion was always for increasing religion. And of course, in Nepal, the Maoists very much mobilized around religion, but it was to dismantle religion and get rid of it from state structures. So we think that that case also supports our story, but teaches us some additional important things about these mechanisms. Then we picked one case out of the sort of that didn't fit the theory according to the aggregate data. So in RELAC, in the religion armed conflict data, Turkey, Kurds in Turkey are coded as not having made claims of religious incompatibility in their civil war against the Turkish state. And we wanted to understand why that was the case, because in terms of the size argument, they fit very well. And in terms of the sharing of religion, so it would have been a case that where we would have expected to see our mechanisms or our theory play out. And what we found in the case of Turkey was that Kurds have indeed mobilized religion, but they've done it in the electoral sphere as opposed to the civil war sphere. And so I think that our conclusion from that case study was primarily that in order to fully understand the various strategies that minorities employ, it is important to take all of the various strategies into account and not just focus on outcomes in civil war or in the electoral arena for groups that are mobilizing in both areas. Finally, what we do in the book is we try to assess whether the Challenger winning coalition helps us understand electoral politics better, whether we see evidence of the type of mobilization, identity mobilization that we see in ethnic civil war in electoral politics also. And for this purpose, we chose one additional case. We expect in electoral politics that we should see marginalized ethnic minority groups led by, one of the largest ethnic groups at the relevant level of administration, use religious claim to appeal across ethnic lines. And what's additional here in electoral politics, what electoral politics adds is that it's very important to take into account institutions and think about the appropriate level of in electoral competition given the institutions. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this case, but I'm just going to say that we did look at Indonesia, and within case comparison at multiple administrative levels suggested to us that there was ample evidence of the Challenger winning coalition being used in electoral politics in Indonesia. And I'm just going to flip very briefly through some slides. Indonesia is an exceptional case because of the amazing ethnic diversity and religious diversity, and the institutional complexity of the case. And so it really allowed us to sort of delve into a case at various different institutional levels to show support for this theory in electoral politics. So just to sort of conclude, it's important to think about why we should care about Challenger winning coalition mobilization, as we argue it happens in this book. And I think there are multiple different reasons. I think there are reasons we should care both across electoral competition, but also civil war competition. And if we just think about the example of religious mobilization in civil war, according to authors in recent work, religious wars are on the rise. Religious wars are more lethal, and religious wars are more intractable. If all of these authors are correct, and if we are correct about the Challengers winning coalition, that leaders, that given the appropriate or the permissive opportunity structures, identity opportunity structures, leaders can choose to mobilize religion, that is something to be concerned about with respect to ethnic civil war and our ability to stop and prevent ethnic civil war. So just to sort of reiterate, we think that we've shown in this book that while theories of segmented and overlapping cleavages and the minimum winning coalition are correct, they leave substantial variation unexplained. And we think that what we are explaining is that sometimes shared identities are actually conflict inducing rather than conflict reducing under a certain set of demographic opportunity structures. And we think that this underexplored, more broadly, that this underexplored demographic variance potentially explains a number of additional puzzles. We have another paper that's forthcoming on the role of organizations in this process. And we are working on papers where we're testing the effect of demographic opportunity structures and identity on separatism and outbidding and et cetera. And with that, I will say thank you for listening and stop for Q&A.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I'll remind our audience that you're welcome to drop any questions you might have into the Q&A box, and I can moderate questions now. I will note that we do have a hard stop at 1 o'clock, and so, but you are welcome to reach out to Dr. Bernier afterwards if you have any further questions or if you'd like to follow up. This usually takes a second while people are like frantically typing and stuff like that. So I usually,
yeah, I'm happy if anybody wants to have a conversation about this also after. I'm you know, obviously very excited about this work and happy to talk about it more.
Of course. Thank you. While everyone else is kind of furiously typing, can you, I know that you recently returned from a trip to Indonesia. Can you kind of talk about your work that you were doing there?
Yeah, so it follows up on this work on identity and mobilization of identity. And what I'm particularly interested in right now is intersectionality and identity. One of the things that we don't do in this book is we don't really think about content. We don't say, you know, how precisely does the content of identity affect mobilization, whether it's contentious or electoral mobilization. And what we know is that because of content of identity, identities tend to be situated in sort of a hierarchical structure in a given country. And how identities overlap and intersect influences the way that that identities then get expressed and mobilized in politics. And of course, the literature on intersectionality was developed by female African-American scholars who found themselves marginalized both in the feminist movement by white women and in the Civil War movement by Black men. And the argument that they made is that in both political contexts, being a Black woman was a separate thing that situated them in this particular hierarchy in a particular way that then influenced their participation and outcomes in these political situations. And so what I want to try to understand is what these sorts of hierarchies are and how they influence political outcomes. And Indonesia is just, I showed you the two pictures of the ethnic diversity and religious diversity in Indonesia, which is, it's one of the most diverse countries in the world. And so what I would like to better understand is how the ranking of identities influences political outcomes and political decisions that are made by political operatives, be they leaders of groups or the public in a given situation. And so in Indonesia, what we were doing when I was there, I was just there in fall doing some field work, is we were running a survey experiment on gender and political outcomes, accounting for ethnicity and religion, and we're eagerly awaiting the results of that survey.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So we have one question. Can you provide a short introduction to the forthcoming paper on the role of organizations?
Yes. So the paper sort of lays out this argument of the challenger winning coalition, specifically in civil war. And then we address the question of organizations. And a lot of the literature right now is focused on organizations. And I think that that's very useful in ethnic organizations. And I think that that's very useful. But the argument that we're making is that the demographics really set the stage. They sort of create the opportunity structures. And so the way that organizational leaders are going to behave is influenced by these demographic opportunity structures. Organizational competition is, however, is often a trigger that puts in motion particular political processes. So what we show empirically in the paper is that organizational competition is not an independent cause of religious claim making, but when organizational competition increases, if the demographic structures that we outline are in place, if they are favorable to religious claim making, then religious claim making will happen. When there's no organizational competition, then it's less likely that this religious claim making will happen, because leaders of large ethnic groups that are the sole representatives of those ethnic groups may have less of an incentive to switch over to religious identity mobilization, because there are costs associated with switching between identities that you're mobilizing in terms of attrition and other things. But if the organizational competition increases, then ethnic leaders, start looking for other ways to create a larger coalition in support of their organization. And that's when we would expect it to be most likely that that you see religious claim making. It's within ethnic minorities that share religion with their majorities and are large, and where there's significant organizational competition. So the organizational competition is like the trigger that pushes the leaders of the group to make religious claims, to try to create an alternative type of mobilization.
Okay, interesting. And for your research for the book, was there anything that particularly surprised you?
Well, the case studies were really interesting to me because we learned so much. There's so much nuance in the way that this happens, obviously. And, like I mentioned a couple of things, like, we think that we found pretty solid evidence in support of the theory in early mobilization in Uganda. But then you get into the history, you get into the story of the LRA and abductions and forced, and then it just becomes an entirely different story, right? And so I think that there are a lot of stories. And then the other thing that we found there was the difference that it makes whether the underlying society is highly fragmented, or whether you have just like two major groups, whether it's polarized society or a very fragmented society. Those are opportunity structures that we need to take into account, because if you have a lot of very small groups, then the political majority may be small enough that you don't need to recruit from them. You can just recruit from the other ethnic groups and unseat the majority in that way. build a viable coalition to unseat the majority in that way. And if you only have two large groups, you necessarily have to recruit from the majority as well. So I think that there are a lot of additional stories that can be told about mobilization strategies, and we're just sort of starting to scratch the surface. And, you know, similarly, like I said, with the case of Nepal, it was sort of one of these really interesting moments where we realized that we had this assumption about how religious mobilization works, that it's necessarily going to be for increasing religious intensity. And that's just not the case. We have to think about, you know, in the case, what's going on, you know, and see what the, you know, really understand what the objectives are of people that are mobilizing. And if I, you know, take one more example, you know, reiterate one more example from the case studies, the Turkish case was just fascinating. You know, and it really sort of drove home the point that you have to look at identity group strategies holistically to really understand the full picture of what they're doing. And you know, other people have pointed out that lots of groups participate in electoral politics at the same time that they are engaged in a civil war. And so they can be pursuing one type of identity strategy in the electoral arena and another type of identity strategy in the civil war. And this is something that I don't think has been shown in the literature before. I think it's just they participate in both arenas and they're sort of employing similar strategies, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So I think that that's one of the things that stands out for me from writing the book, was just all of these additional nuances that came through that we learned along the way.
Sure. And excuse me. In particular, is there any particular, what would you like people to kind of take away from this book, whether they be academics or practitioners or just members of the public?
I think that, well, for academics, I think that this opens up a whole research agenda. You know, we have just sort of been thinking that the Leipart and Horowitz story on segmented and shared cleavages was the end. And this really breaks open that box and says, no, that's just the beginning. And I think that's a very fruitful research agenda moving forward. For more sort of general public, I think that, you know, what I highlighted with respect to religion at the end is pretty important. You know, if we take seriously this idea that there isn't anything inherent about identity mobilization, that identity mobilization is subject to, you know, opportunity and a variety of different types of opportunities and incentives, then it becomes clear that leaders under certain circumstances can pick the type of identity that they're mobilizing. And if authors are correct, that some of those identity mobilizations are more problematic than others, and they can be picked because you know, that serves you know, a purpose for leaders or of groups that are mobilizing, we really need to take seriously the idea of you know, identity mobilization and variances in identity mobilization. And when we're building institutional structures, for example, really think through what kind of identity mobilization is this going to incentivize? And is it the type of identity mobilization that we think is healthy for whatever political competition we would like to see in this circumstance?
Great. So that does wrap up our time for today. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been fascinating.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. This has been really fun. And please send me questions or comments, or if you want to talk further, I'm always happy to.
Of course. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for sticking with us today. Be sure to check out our later events, and thank you so much and have a wonderful day.